We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. With the Democratic National Convention in the rearview mirror, we're going to examine Joe Biden's swan song, what the Kamala Harris campaign is up to next, everything you didn't want to know about price controls, and what Donald Trump means when he talks about abolishing the Department of Education. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Joe Biden delivering his own political eulogy at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago last week had all the hallmarks of somebody essentially stepping down from his high position in Washington society. And somebody who's been covering this, and I think personally wrote the quintessential article on Joe Biden's swan song, is Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner, who happens to be joining us today. Thanks for being here, Tim.
It's always fun, Mark. Thank you.
So, Tim, I think it's great to have you. It seemed to me that Joe Biden was saying goodbye to the world stage there. What's your take?
Well, he was willing to suffer the indignity of being forced out of his bid for re-election. They did everything they could to squeeze him out. The money dried up, the support dried up, everything dried up, and he was left with no choice but to vacate the top position on the ticket. So they were faced with a very difficult situation here because of all the personal animosities between Biden and Pelosi, between Biden and Obama, between Obama and Biden. Biden's still bitter that he was not handpicked by Barack Obama to run in 2016 in favor of Hillary Clinton. And by the way, he was probably right. Biden would have had a better chance to beat Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton did, but be that as it may, with all these personal animosities flying back and forth, they figured the safest thing to do was to schedule Joe Biden for the latest possible legitimate time on the first night of the convention, which was 10:50 p.m. And he didn't even hit the stage till almost 11:30, and then spoke for almost an hour in angry, often bitter tones. His words did not betray that bitterness, but his body language certainly did. And, he did his best to sort of pass on an endorsement to Kamala Harris, maybe 20, 25 minutes into the speech. But I think it was kind of a sad ending to a 50-year career and I thought the appropriate thing about Joe Biden was his own recognition, finally, of his age and infirmity when he said at a rally in Maryland recently, when I got into the Senate, I was only 29 years old. I was too damn young to be able to run anything in the Senate. Now I'm too damn old. And I think that tells the truth of Joe Biden. And I can understand his bitterness, to be honest with you, Mark, because he's the only person that's ever beaten Donald Trump, and he beat him by about 4.5% in 2020, depending on how much you believe the final tallies and all that. And he says, I beat him once, I can do it again, but he's not going to get the chance. And I think we saw the remnants of that bitterness in the speech. But very few did, because they pushed him so late on the first night of the convention that it seemed pretty obvious they were trying to shove him off the stage. It's almost like the old thing in vaudeville where they pull out the hook and they hook the guy by the neck off the stage. I think it was almost one of those kind of situations.
It was very much a Chuck Barris gong show moment, wasn't it? It's funny that you mentioned twice.
Well, he brought up all the old stuff about Trump and very fine people on both sides and losers and suckers. All of these things have been debunked And yet he keeps going back to them and referring to a falsehood that was the very basis for his candidacy, which was very fine people on both sides. It took me off the sidelines and forced me into the race to rid the country of the scourge of Donald Trump. Uh, so, on the one hand, they had to push him out because he had no chance to win. On the other hand, he has legitimate beefs about receiving 13 million votes, essentially 100% of the primary votes. He played the game the way it was supposed to be played, and then he got hooked off the stage.
It was actually one of the few times that I felt sorry for Joe Biden
Yeah.
was when I realized that they're going to keep him out of prime time, not just East Coast prime time. West Coast prime time's gone as well. They didn't want the world to see him and see him expressing the recrimination that you're right. It suffused everything that he did, even if it didn't actually come out in the words. But there was anger there at being so poorly treated when he brought his party back from under the thumb of Donald Trump,
Yep.
which obviously I don't think it would have happened if there weren't the pandemic. I think it would have been a very different election.
Perhaps. But I will point out, Mark, that I went back and reviewed the polls before the pandemic, and Trump was losing fairly badly then, too. So when it came down to it, with a strong and vibrant economy and all the jobs and everything that Trump created, he might still have won. But he didn't. Biden did, even if he hid in the basement, even if it was obvious he had lost a step or two. All he had to do was be not Donald Trump and present as a moderate figure to bring the country back to normalcy. He presented as that the few times that he did present himself, 2020, but it was clear up or down on Donald Trump. It was a referendum on Donald Trump. This time it would have been a referendum on Joe Biden. And the party leaders could not bear that burden because they knew they would lose with Joe Biden. They feel like they at least have a chance with Kamala Harris.
So Scott Jennings, I believe he's a senior political analyst or reporter over at
CNN.
over at
Yes.
CNN. He made the case recently that for the 12 of the last 16 years have been the country's been under Democrat control. And there was 8 years with Obama
Or with Biden.
and Joe Biden there.
Right.
And then of course there's the next ones with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And she's talking about how she's going to fix the problems of the country as if she and her boss haven't been at the levers of power all along. And a thought struck me, and it was Kamala Harris seems to think that she can be unburdened by what has been. Now, does she mean unburdened by her and her party's record out of 12 of the last 16 years? Is that what needs to be unburdened before she can claim the crown?
Well, she's made only one single policy pronouncement so far. And essentially what it was a Soviet-style web of price controls, wage controls, higher minimum wages, things that would absolutely destroy the economy.
Comrade Stalin would be proud.
So it's true. And so you understand why they were, it's a conundrum, Mark, because on the one hand, she won't interview. She won't sit down and speak with a legitimate journalist. All she'll do is read teleprompter speeches. And so far, it's working for her. It's been 32 days, 33, 34 by the time we get past the convention and she still will not have submitted to an interview. And there's a good reason for that, because number one, this is working, and number two, if other policy pronouncements are consistent with her price controls, she's going to scare off the country so fast that she could lose in a landslide. So, they're trying to keep her under wraps, and politically, that's probably a smart thing because she has the reputation of being an empty suit. And so I think that they want to concentrate their efforts on the debate with Donald Trump on September 10th to be her big sort of coming out with details of her policies to correct what the policies are now from her administration.
It almost seems like a Thomas Dewey-esque campaign against Truman, and we all remember how that turned out. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.